I'm taking the house, both cars, and every last penny from our accounts, he said, sliding the divorce papers across our kitchen table with a smirk. My lawyer made sure there's nothing left for you. Enjoy starting over at 45. But when he received that call from his banker 3 months later, his face must have turned ghost white. Because while he was busy dividing our visible assets, he completely overlooked the offshore account I'd quietly built over the years, the one now worth $2.7 million. I stared at the legal documents before me, the black and white text blurring slightly as I maintained my composure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Our Westlake mansion, the vacation property in Sedona, the investment portfolio we'd built over 15 years of marriage, all now allocated to Gregory's side of the ledger. Even my grandmother's antique jewelry collection, which had never truly belonged to us in the first place. My soon-to-be ex-husband stood across from me, straightening the cuffs of his bespoke suit, a habit he'd developed after making partner at his firm. There was a certain satisfaction in his eyes, the kind that comes from believing you've orchestrated the perfect exit. Clean, clinical, complete. "Catherine, don't look so shocked," he said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone he'd perfected during cross-examinations. "You must have known this was coming. I've outgrown this marriage, and frankly, I've outgrown you." I looked up at him, keeping my expression deliberately neutral. Not broken, not angry, just patient. "Is there anything else, Gregory?" I asked, my voice steadier than even I expected. He seemed momentarily thrown by my calmness, perhaps expecting tears or pleading. That would have fed his ego, given him one final victory to savor. Instead, my composure created the first hairline fracture in his confidence. "My lawyer will contact yours with the final settlement details," he said, retrieving his Italian leather briefcase from beside the chair. "I've arranged for you to have 2 weeks to vacate the property." I nodded, folding my hands in my lap. "That's very generous of you." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Gregory had always needed the satisfaction of knowing he'd affected. Me controlled my emotional state. My serenity was clearly not the reaction he'd scripted for this dramatic finale. "Kathy," he said, reverting to the nickname I'd always disliked, "let's not pretend you're taking this well. You have nothing. No career, no savings of your own, no prospects." He gestured around at our custom-designed kitchen with its hand-painted tiles we'd selected in Barcelona. "This lifestyle you've grown accustomed to? It's over." I allowed myself a small smile then, just the barest upturning of lips. Not enough to reveal anything, just enough to plant a seed of doubt. "I'll manage, Gregory." He lingered a moment longer, studying me as if trying to solve an unexpected puzzle. Then, with a dismissive shake of his head, he turned and walked through the kitchen, down the hallway, and out the front door of what had been our home for the last decade. The heavy oak door closed with a definitive thud. Only then did I allow myself to exhale fully, unfolding my hands and reaching for the stack of papers he'd left. The dissolution of 15 years laid out in careful legalese, each clause and provision designed to strip me of everything while maintaining the appearance of fairness. Outside, I heard the distinctive purr of his Aston Martin starting up, followed by the crunch of tires on our circular gravel driveway. I walked to the window just in time to see the sleek silver vehicle disappear down the tree-lined lane, carrying away the man who believed he had just delivered the final devastating blow to our relationship. What Gregory didn't know, what he had never bothered to discover during our marriage, was that I had been preparing for this moment for nearly 7 years, not out of pessimism or lack of commitment, but because I had seen the subtle shifts in his character as his success grew. I had noticed the gradual emotional detachment, the increasingly frequent late nights at the office, the business trips that somehow required his newest associate, Meredith, to accompany him. I had watched his transformation from ambitious young attorney to entitled senior partner who viewed people as either assets or liabilities. And somewhere along the way, I had realized I had been reclassified in his mind from the former to the latter. So while Gregory believed he was executing a flawlessly planned exit strategy, I had been quietly executing my own contingency plan. One that had begun with a single international wire transfer to Grand Cayman back in 2016. I moved away from the window and walked through our home, still legally ours for the next 14 days. My fingers trailed along the expensive furnishings, the art pieces we'd collected from galleries around the world, the photographs from happier times that still adorned the walls despite the growing distance between us in recent years. None of these things mattered now. They were just objects, status symbols that Gregory had always valued far more than I did. What mattered was what remained unseen, untouched by his legal team's thorough asset search. I made my way to my home office, a space Gregory rarely entered, dismissing it as my hobby room where I managed the household and pursued what he considered inconsequential interests, like the online financial courses I'd been taking for years, or the international investment forums I frequented while he assumed I was browsing social media. I unlocked my desk drawer and removed a small, unmarked key. Not to a safety deposit box or a hidden wall safe. Gregory's team had found and emptied those months ago during their meticulous preparations. No, this key opened a post office box in a neighboring town, registered under my maiden name, where I received correspondence from Parton Wainwright, a private banking firm in the Cayman Islands. The irony wasn't lost on me. Gregory, with his legal brilliance and strategic mind, had orchestrated what he believed was the perfect financial decimation of his wife. He had tracked down every domestic account, every investment, every property and asset we jointly owned. His legal team had spent months ensuring I would be left with virtually nothing. Yet he had missed the most significant asset of all, because it existed in a place he never thought to look, managed by a woman he had consistently underestimated. Sat at my desk and opened my laptop. In 2 weeks, I would indeed leave this house as Gregory had demanded. But I wouldn't be leaving as the destitute, broken woman he envisioned. I entered my passwords and pulled up my secure email. There it was, confirmation from Mr. Harrington at Parton Wainwright that the final transfer had been completed successfully. The offshore account, built steadily over years through careful investments and strategic planning, now held assets totaling just over $2.7 million. Gregory had taken everything he could see. But he had forgotten about what he couldn't see, what he had never bothered to notice. I closed the laptop and allowed myself a genuine smile. The game wasn't over. It had barely begun. I moved through the house that evening with a strange sense of lightness. The weight of pretense had finally lifted. For years, I'd maintained the facade of the devoted corporate wife, smiling through charity galas while Gregory networked, hosting dinner parties where I was little more than decorative background to his professional ambitions. Now, in the quiet aftermath of his dramatic exit, I could finally drop the act. I poured myself a glass of the Chateau Margaux he'd been saving for a special occasion. This certainly qualified. Settling into the window seat of his library, I watched darkness fall over the manicured gardens and reflected on the journey that had led me here. It had begun with a conversation overheard at one of Gregory's firm parties 7 years ago. I'd been retrieving my wrap when I overheard his managing partner, James, advising a junior associate about asset protection. "Smart men always have a contingency plan," James had said, "a place where resources can be sheltered from unexpected complications." He'd gone on to mention several offshore jurisdictions, naming banks and contacts with the casual confidence of someone who'd long ago secured his own financial fortress. I'd lingered, absorbing every word, something instinctive telling me to pay attention. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That night, while Gregory slept soundly beside me, I'd opened my laptop and begun researching. By morning, I understood the basics of offshore banking, international financial privacy laws, and how wealth could be legally structured to remain invisible to all but the most determined investigations. The next week, I'd withdrawn $50,000 from my personal savings, money inherited from my grandmother, that Gregory had always dismissed as sentimental funds. He'd never bothered to ask how much I'd actually inherited, assuming it was insignificant compared to his income. That first transfer to Parton Wainwright had felt terrifying and exhilarating at once. I'd used my maiden name, Catherine Ellison, and established the account with documentation I'd carefully assembled: my passport, birth certificate, and the trust paperwork from my grandmother's estate. Mr. Harrington, the discreet private banker who would become my financial ally over the years, had guided me through the process with professional efficiency. There had been no judgment in his eyes, only a knowing wisdom that told me I wasn't the first spouse to take such precautions. "Many of our clients find that financial autonomy provides peace of mind, Mrs. Ellison," he'd said, using my maiden name with deliberate formality. "Particularly those in partnerships where financial control might otherwise be unbalanced." Over the following years, I'd continued making transfers, never large enough to trigger Gregory's attention, always timed around legitimate expenses he wouldn't question. A supposed girls' trip to Paris became a visit to the Cayman Islands. Charitable donations to women's organizations partially made their way into investments under my direction. Household renovation funds found new purposes in emerging market opportunities. I'd educated myself relentlessly. Online courses in financial management, investment strategies, and international banking. Forums where wealthy divorcees shared their experiences and warnings. Quiet consultations with financial advisors in other cities, always paid in cash, never leaving a trail that led back to our shared life. And Gregory, brilliant legal mind that he was, never noticed. He was too consumed with his own importance, too certain of my dependence, too convinced of my financial naivety to imagine I was capable of such foresight. The same qualities that had attracted me in our early days, his confidence, ambition, and strategic thinking, had evolved into the arrogance and emotional detachment that ultimately destroyed our marriage. But they had also created the perfect blind spot in which I could operate undetected. I took another sip of his precious wine, appreciating the rich complexity he would never taste. The bottle had cost over $1,000, an extravagance he'd justified as an investment. How fitting that it would now commemorate not his triumph, but mine. My phone buzzed with a calendar alert, a reminder of tomorrow's appointment with my own lawyer, not the passive, conciliatory attorney Gregory assumed I'd hired, but Vivian Zhao, a formidable divorce specialist known for her strategic brilliance and ironclad discretion. What Gregory didn't know was that Vivian and I had been consulting for months. While his legal team had been constructing the settlement I'd received today, we'd been building our response. The apparent capitulation Gregory had witnessed was merely Act 1 in a carefully orchestrated performance. I wasn't fighting for the house, the cars, or the visible trappings of our marriage. Those battles would only alert him that I was more prepared than he thought. Instead, we had focused on ensuring the offshore account remained undetectable, its growing fortune secure from his grasping hands. "Let him think he's won the war," Vivian had advised during our first meeting. "Men like your husband need to believe they're the victors. It blinds them to the battles they're actually losing." I finished the wine and stood, taking in the room with fresh eyes. The leather-bound law books Gregory displayed but rarely opened. The hunting prints he'd chosen because they matched the decor, not from any actual interest in the sport. The photographs of him shaking hands with judges and politicians, relationships he cultivated not for friendship but for advantage. How hollow it all seemed now. A curated display of success that masked the failure of what truly mattered. I moved to my bedroom, the guest suite I'd been occupying since Gregory had claimed our master bedroom needed renovation, a transparent excuse to distance himself physically as our marriage disintegrated. From the back of the closet, I retrieved a small fireproof case containing the documents I would need in the coming weeks: my passport, birth certificate, the key cards for my private banking access, and a USB drive containing encrypted copies of every financial record relevant to my offshore holdings. 7 years of patience and planning were about to bear fruit. While Gregory celebrated his supposed victory, I would be executing the final phase of my strategy. Not with angry confrontation or public exposure, but with the same methodical precision I'd employed all along. The pieces were in place. The timing was perfect. And Gregory, for all his legal expertise and calculated maneuvering, had fatally underestimated the woman he'd dismissed as nothing more than an accessory to his success. I placed the case into the designer overnight bag I'd already packed. Tomorrow, after meeting with Vivian, I wouldn't be returning to this house to meekly pack up my remaining possessions as Gregory expected. Instead, I would be checking into the Four Seasons downtown, where I'd reserved the executive suite for the next month, my temporary headquarters as I transitioned to the next chapter of my life. From there, I would watch as Gregory's confidence gradually transformed into confusion, then alarmed uncertainty, and finally, desperate realization. The process would be slow, controlled, and entirely on my terms. I looked around the guest suite one last time, confirming I'd left nothing essential behind. There was a certain poetic justice to the situation. Gregory had spent years treating me as a guest in my own marriage. Now I would leave like one, quietly, with dignity, taking only what truly belonged to me, including the $2.7 million he didn't know existed. The Four Seasons executive suite offered a perspective I hadn't experienced in years, both literally and figuratively. From the 43rd floor, the city sprawled beneath me, a glittering grid of possibilities rather than the isolated suburban enclave Gregory had insisted we inhabit, for privacy and prestige. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the morning light transform the glass and steel landscape. Downtown pulsed with an energy I'd missed during my years in our gated community, where neighbors rarely interacted beyond perfunctory waves and obligatory holiday gatherings. The suite itself was a study in understated luxury, nothing ostentatious or showy, just quiet sophistication and thoughtful design. It felt cleansing somehow, to be surrounded by elegance that existed for function and comfort rather than status and display. My meeting with Vivian had gone precisely as planned. We'd reviewed the final settlement documents Gregory had presented, noting with amusement the extra clauses his lawyers had inserted to ensure I couldn't claim any future earnings, business interests, or investment returns. "He's certainly thorough in his cruelty," Vivian had remarked, her keen eyes scanning the pages. "This level of financial scorched earth is actually quite revealing." "How so?" I'd asked, though I already suspected the answer. "It suggests fear," she said simply. "This isn't just about leaving you with nothing. It's about ensuring you remain nothing. Men who are truly confident in their power don't need such comprehensive destruction. They're secure enough to be generous." We'd discussed the timing of my counter-strategy. Not a legal battle over the assets Gregory had claimed, but a carefully orchestrated series of moves that would secure my new life while allowing him to believe he'd achieved his goal. "The key is maintaining the illusion of defeat until the precise moment of revelation," Vivian had advised. "Like chess, the winning move often looks like surrender until it's too late." I moved away from the window and settled at the elegant desk the hotel had provided. Opening my laptop, I reviewed the secure messages from Mr. Harrington. The funds from my offshore account had been successfully structured according to my instructions. A portion transferred to a newly established domestic account under my maiden name. Another segment invested in a diverse portfolio managed by a boutique firm Vivian had recommended, and the remainder left in the Cayman Islands, continuing to grow under Mr. Harrington's careful stewardship. A soft chime from my phone interrupted my thoughts, a text from Rebecca, my oldest friend and the only person who knew the full extent of my preparations. Heard through Marcus that G was celebrating at Capitol Grill last night. Apparently ordered the 82 Bordeaux and was quite loose-lipped about his fresh start. How are you holding up? I smiled at her deliberate understatement. Rebecca's husband, Marcus, was a partner at a rival firm and occasionally intersected with Gregory at bar association events. Their tacit intelligence gathering had provided valuable insights over the years. Settled at the Four Seasons, I replied. Everything proceeding as planned. Lunch next week? Her response was immediate. Perfect. Can't wait to see his face when reality finally hits. Neither could I, though I wasn't motivated by vengeance so much as a desire for justice. Gregory had systematically dismantled our partnership long before he'd presented those divorce papers. The emotional withdrawal, the gradual exclusion from decisions, the subtle undermining of my confidence, all while maintaining the public facade of the successful power couple. I set my phone aside and returned to the window, watching a private helicopter land on a nearby building. For 15 years, I'd lived in Gregory's carefully constructed reality, a world where his ambitions dictated our choices, his preferences shaped our lifestyle, and his definition of success became the measure of our worth. The painful truth was that I'd allowed it. I'd surrendered my voice in small increments, rationalized his behavior as the natural consequence of his drive and position, accepted the growing distance as an inevitable evolution of long-term marriage. But something had shifted 7 years ago, not just the overheard conversation that had sparked my financial awakening, but a deeper, more fundamental recognition of my own value. The offshore account had begun as a prudent contingency plan, but it had evolved into something more profound, a declaration of independence. Every transfer, every investment decision, every strategic move had been an affirmation of my capability and autonomy. While Gregory saw a compliant wife maintaining his domestic domain, I was quietly reclaiming my agency, one deliberate action at a time. The suite phone rang, hotel management checking that everything met my expectations. I assured them it did, declining their offer of dinner reservations or theater tickets. Tonight, I wanted solitude and reflection. After the call, I moved to the bathroom with its marble finishes and deep-soaking tub. I ran the water, adding the lavender bath oil I'd packed, and considered the stark contrast between this moment and where I'd been just 24 hours ago, sitting across from Gregory as he delivered what he believed was my sentence to insignificance. I sank into the warm water, feeling months of tension begin to dissolve. For the first time since Gregory had begun his calculated withdrawal from our marriage, I felt truly at peace. Not because I had secretly outmaneuvered him, but because I had finally stopped defining myself in relation to him. The woman who emerged from this bath would not be Gregory's discarded wife, but Catherine Ellison, the name on my offshore accounts, the identity I was reclaiming, the self I had gradually rediscovered during those years of quiet preparation. Tomorrow would bring the next phase of my plan. I would begin the deliberate construction of my new life. Appointments with realtors to find a permanent residence, meetings with financial advisors to structure my visible assets, consultations about potential business ventures I'd been researching for months, all while Gregory continued believing he had left me with nothing but uncertainty and desperation. I closed my eyes, letting the warm water envelop me. The suite was silent except for the distant hum of the city below, a rhythm so different from the sterile quiet of the Westlake mansion. This silence felt alive with possibility rather than heavy with absence. In 2 days, the divorce would be finalized. Gregory would sign the papers with the smug satisfaction of a victor claiming spoils. I would sign with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the true score, and then the countdown would begin. As I sipped my morning coffee on the private balcony of my suite, watching the city awaken beneath me, my mind drifted back to the moment. I first suspected my marriage wasn't what I'd believed it to be, the initial crack in the foundation that had eventually led to its collapse. It had been during our 10th anniversary trip to Lake Como, a celebration Gregory had initially resisted. The firm has the Westbrook merger that week, but eventually conceded after I'd insisted. We were dining on the terrace of a restaurant overlooking the water, the kind of breathtaking setting that should inspire romance and connection. Instead, Gregory had spent most of the evening on his phone, ostensibly dealing with urgent client matters. I'd tried to engage him in conversation about the historic villa we'd toured earlier, about plans for the rest of our trip, about anything beyond his work. "Can we just enjoy this moment?" I'd finally asked, gesturing to the sunset painting, the lake in hues of amber and gold. He'd glanced up, irritation flickering across his features. "I am enjoying it, Catherine, but some of us can't just turn off our responsibilities because the view is pretty." There it was, the first time he'd openly drawn that line between us, some of us versus you. The distinction between his important, meaningful work and my apparently frivolous existence. I'd fallen silent, watching him return to his emails with visible relief. Later that night, when he'd finally set his phone aside and reached for me in the darkness of our suite, I'd realized with startling clarity that physical intimacy had become the only language left between us, and even that felt increasingly like a transaction rather than a connection. But the real awakening had come the following morning. While Gregory showered, his phone had chimed with an incoming text. I hadn't meant to look, not initially, but the preview notification had caught my eye. "Missing you already. Last night was exactly what I needed." The sender, Meredith Collins, the junior associate who had joined his firm 6 months earlier. I'd stood frozen, the message burning into my consciousness. When Gregory emerged from the bathroom, I'd handed him his phone without comment, watching his face carefully. There had been no guilt, no discomfort, just a casual thanks as he pocketed the device. That night at dinner, I'd casually mentioned Meredith, asking how she was settling into the firm. His response had been measured, professional, a performance so convincing that for a moment I'd doubted my suspicions. "She's proving quite valuable," he'd said, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "Sharp mind, good instincts. Carter thinks she has partner potential, though that's premature. You're working closely with her on the Westbrook merger, aren't you?" I'd asked, keeping my tone light, conversational. His eyes had flickered up, a momentary assessment. "Among others. Why?" I'd smiled, lifting my wine glass. "Just making conversation, Gregory. You speak of her often." I was curious. That moment, his brief, calculating look followed by a slight relaxation when he decided I was merely making expected wife conversation, had stayed with me. It wasn't definitive proof of infidelity, but something more insidious. Evidence of his assumption that I wasn't perceptive enough, intelligent enough, or significant enough to warrant his concern. More signs had accumulated after that trip. Credit. Card statements showing dinners in restaurants we had never visited together. Late nights that became routine rather than exception. His gradually increasing irritation with domestic questions or attempts to participate in discussions about his work. Then came the subtle financial shifts. Investment decisions made without consultation. New accounts opened that weren't joint. Holdings. The casual mention of a tax strategy his firm's financial advisors had recommended, one that had effectively moved substantial assets solely under his control. "It's just more efficient this way," he'd explained when I'd questioned the change. "You've never been interested in the financial details, Kathy. This saves us both the headache." The ease with which he'd dismissed my concerns had been revelatory. He hadn't even bothered to craft a convincing lie because he didn't consider me worthy of the effort. In his mind, I was already categorized as inconsequential, a decorative element in his life rather than a partner. That realization had been both painful and liberating. The pain had come from acknowledging that the man I'd married, the passionate, ambitious attorney who had once valued my insights and support, had evolved into someone who saw me as an asset whose value had depreciated. The liberation had emerged from understanding that his assessment of me no longer mattered, because it was fundamentally flawed. There in the hotel room, I took a final sip of my coffee and returned to the present moment. Those early warning signs hadn't just been about Gregory's infidelity or financial maneuvering. They had revealed the profound imbalance that had developed in our relationship. An imbalance he had cultivated, perhaps unconsciously at first, but with increasing deliberation as his power and status grew. What Gregory had never understood, what he still didn't understand, was that in undermining our partnership, he had inadvertently created the conditions for my independence. Each dismissive comment, each unilateral decision, each subtle condescension had gradually severed the emotional ties that might have kept me loyal to a failing marriage. By the time he decided I was disposable, I had already begun building a life beyond his control. I checked my watch, 9:30. In an hour, I would meet with Elise Bennett, a realtor specializing in downtown properties, to begin my search for a permanent residence. After that, lunch with a former colleague who had successfully launched an art consulting business catering to corporate clients, a venture I'd been researching for months as a potential next chapter. My phone chimed with a text from Vivian. Final papers ready for signature tomorrow, 2 p.m. His attorney confirms Gregory will be present. I sent a brief acknowledgement, feeling a curious calm at the prospect of facing Gregory again. Tomorrow would mark the official end of our marriage, though the true dissolution had occurred years ago. In Gregory's mind, it would also represent his final victory, the culmination of his careful strategy to discard me while retaining everything of value. If only he understood what everything of value truly meant. The final divorce hearing lasted precisely 47 minutes. Gregory arrived with his attorney, Harrison Wells, both men projecting an aura of efficient triumph. They barely acknowledged me beyond the necessary formalities. Their conversation focused on an upcoming golf tournament at Gregory's club. I sat quietly beside Vivian, who had advised minimal interaction. Let them enjoy their perceived victory, she'd counseled. Strategic advantage often comes from being underestimated. Judge Lowell, a colleague of Gregory's from his early career, moved through the proceedings with practiced detachment. I noticed the subtle familiarity in his address to Gregory, Counselor Moore, versus the more formal Mrs. Moore, directed at me. Another reminder of the insular professional world Gregory inhabited, where connections and allegiances shaped outcomes, in ways both obvious and invisible. When the moment came to sign the final documents, Gregory used his monogrammed fountain pen, a 5th anniversary gift I'd had specially made for him. The casual appropriation of my gesture felt emblematic of our entire relationship, my contributions, repurposed to serve his narrative. I signed with the hotel pen I'd deliberately brought, a small but meaningful choice. This ending would not be written with instruments from our shared past. As the judge declared our marriage legally dissolved, Gregory allowed himself a brief, satisfied smile. He'd gotten everything he wanted: the properties, the investment accounts, the art collection, even the vacation home in Sedona that had originally been purchased with part of my inheritance. What I received was my car, the less valuable of our two vehicles, my personal belongings, and a settlement amount that, while technically fair on paper, represented a fraction of our marital assets. The disparity was stark, deliberate, and exactly as I had anticipated. "Catherine," Gregory said as we exited the courtroom, his tone carrying that particular blend of false concern and condescension he'd perfected over the years. "Harrison has prepared the paperwork for the house. You'll have until the end of the month to remove your remaining possessions." I nodded, maintaining the calm demeanor that had visibly unsettled him throughout the proceedings. "That won't be necessary. I've already taken what matters to me." Something flickered across his face, curiosity perhaps, or the first hint of uncertainty. He hadn't expected practical competence, having grown accustomed to my dependence on his management of such details. "Well," he said, recovering quickly, "that's efficient of you. I assume Vivian has explained the financial arrangements?" "In complete detail," Vivian interjected smoothly. "Catherine is fully informed about her position." Gregory nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good. Well, I suppose this concludes our business." He extended his hand, the gesture more appropriate for a corporate merger than the end of 15 years together. "I wish you the best, Catherine." I accepted the handshake briefly, noting the expensive new watch on his wrist. Likely a self-congratulatory purchase to mark this moment. "Goodbye, Gregory." As he turned to leave with Harrison, I experienced not the grief or anger he might have expected, but a profound sense of clarity. The man walking away was a stranger who happened to share memories with a person I used to be. Whatever genuine connection we'd once had been systematically dismantled by his choices and my responses to them. "Are you all right?" Vivian asked as we watched them disappear down the courthouse corridor. "Better than all right," I replied truthfully. "I feel unburdened." She smiled, her expression knowing. That's the difference between ending something toxic and losing something valuable. Now shall we proceed with phase 2? We exited the courthouse into brilliant spring sunshine. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. One chapter concluding, another beginning with clear light and fresh possibilities. My car was parked across the street, but I had no intention of returning to the Westlake mansion, not even to collect the few items I'd strategically left behind. "I've been thinking about your recommendation," I said as we walked. "About waiting to access the offshore funds." Vivian nodded thoughtfully. "Timing is crucial. Too soon, and it raises questions about disclosures during the proceedings. Too late, and you miss the optimal psychological impact." 3 months, I decided. Long enough for Gregory to believe his victory is complete, short enough for the revelation to still connect to his actions. She smiled approvingly. "Perfect. And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, I become Catherine Ellison again, visibly rebuilding with the modest settlement, living within its constraints, establishing my new identity. Nothing that would trigger his suspicion or ego." We reached her car, a sleek Audi that reflected her successful practice. "The art consultancy?" "Still pursuing it, but slowly. I've scheduled meetings with potential clients who have no connection to Gregory's circles. Building from the foundation, exactly as we discussed." Vivian regarded me with genuine admiration. "You know, in 15 years of divorce practice, I've rarely seen someone navigate this process with such clarity and purpose. Most clients are either paralyzed by emotion or driven by vengeance." I had 7 years to process those feelings, I reminded her. And vengeance was never my goal. "Justice, then," she suggested. I considered this as the spring breeze carried the scent of newly blooming magnolias from the courthouse garden. "Not even that, really. This isn't about punishing Gregory. It's about reclaiming what's mine, my independence, my agency, my future." She nodded, understanding. "The secondary account is active then? The one using your maiden name?" "Yes. Limited funds transferred, exactly as we planned. Enough to establish my new life visibly, not enough to raise questions." "And the offshore account remains secure?" "Completely. Mr. Harrington has confirmed that all traces have been obscured. As far as any financial investigation could determine, those assets simply don't exist." Vivian checked her watch. "I have a client at 2. Will you be all right?" I smiled at her concern. "More than all right. I'm having lunch with Rebecca to celebrate, and then meeting with a real estate agent about a loft in the Arts District." She hesitated, then offered an uncharacteristic hug. "Call me if you need anything, professional or otherwise." As I watched her drive away, I felt a moment of profound gratitude. Vivian had been more than legal counsel. She had been a strategic partner in my emergence from a marriage that had slowly consumed my identity. Now, standing alone on the courthouse steps, I made the conscious decision to look forward, not back. Gregory believed he had orchestrated my diminishment. In 3 months, he would discover how profoundly he had miscalculated. But that revelation would be on my terms, in my time. The pieces were in motion, the strategy set. All that remained was patience, a quality I had cultivated to perfection over 7 careful years. The Cayman Islands in February offered a perfect contrast to the snow-covered cityscape I'd left behind. Crystalline waters, gentle breezes, and, crucially, a banking system renowned for its discretion. My visit had been meticulously planned to coincide with a legitimate art exhibition in Miami, providing the perfect cover for my 2-day detour to Grand Cayman. I remembered the mixture of anxiety and exhilaration as I'd entered the understated offices of Parton Wainwright for the first time. The building itself was unremarkable, intentionally so, I later learned, with nothing to suggest the substantial wealth managed within its walls. "Mrs. Ellison," Mr. Harrington had greeted me, using my maiden name with a natural ease that had momentarily startled me. It had been years since anyone had addressed me that way. "Welcome to Parton Wainwright. Please follow me." His office had been tastefully appointed but not ostentatious, polished mahogany, muted artworks, and windows offering glimpses of palm trees and azure water. Privacy and competence radiated from every detail. "Before we begin," he'd said once. We were seated. "May I ask what prompted your interest in our services? It helps us tailor our approach to your specific needs." I'd considered my response carefully. "I find myself in a position where financial autonomy has become essential to my long-term security." He'd nodded, understanding the subtext immediately. "Many of our clients share similar concerns. Rest assured that discretion is the foundation of our practice. Perhaps you could share your immediate objectives?" That first meeting had lasted nearly 3 hours. Mr. Harrington had patiently explained the intricacies of offshore banking, the legal frameworks that govern such arrangements, and the strategic options available to someone in my position. I'd been clear about my intentions. I'm not looking to hide assets unlawfully or evade obligations. I simply need to establish financial security independent of my current domestic situation. "A prudent approach," he'd affirmed. "We operate within all legal parameters while maximizing privacy and protection. The key is proper structure and timing." By the end of that first visit, I'd established an initial account with my $50,000 inheritance funds. A modest beginning, but one that Mr. Harrington assured me could grow substantially with the right investment strategy. "The advantage of our boutique approach," he'd explained, "is personalized portfolio management. Based on your risk tolerance and timeline, we can implement a diversification strategy that balances growth potential with security." I'd left the Caymans with a small, unmarked keycard, secure login credentials, and a profound sense of having taken my first meaningful step toward independence. The money itself had been significant, but the psychological impact had been transformative. For the first time in years, I'd acted decisively in my own interest without seeking Gregory's approval or considering his reaction. Now, 3 years later, that initial deposit had multiplied exponentially through a combination of strategic investments, timely market plays, and the addition of funds I'd gradually channeled offshore. Mr. Harrington had proven himself not just a banker, but a financial ally, guiding decisions with expertise while respecting my growing investment acumen. The morning after the divorce was finalized, I initiated the next phase of my financial strategy. From my hotel suite, I logged into the secure portal Mr. Harrington had established, using the encrypted laptop I'd purchased specifically for managing my offshore affairs. The balance displayed, $2,736,842, still gave me a moment of disbelief. Not because I was unaware of the amount, but because the figure represented something beyond money. It was the tangible result of years of careful planning, disciplined execution, and quiet determination. Following our agreed protocol, I sent Mr. Harrington a secure message. Phase 1 complete as of yesterday. Please initiate Structure B as discussed during our March meeting. First domestic transfer to proceed on schedule, 90 days. Will require updated documentation for secondary portfolio distribution. His response came within the hour. Confirmation received. Structure B implementation underway. Documentation for secondary distribution will be prepared for your review by end of week. Congratulations on reaching this milestone, Mrs. Ellison. Structure B, as we had coded it, involved a carefully orchestrated series of transfers that would eventually bring a portion of my offshore funds back into domestic accounts, without raising flags or creating obvious connections to the Cayman holdings. It was entirely legal, meticulously documented, and deliberately paced to avoid any appearance of impropriety related to the divorce settlement. The first transfer would occur exactly 3 months from the divorce finalization, a $250,000 movement, to my newly established domestic account at Atlantic Provincial Bank, an institution with no connection to Gregory's financial ecosystem. This initial deposit would be documented as proceeds from the sale of family property in Vermont, a transaction I had legitimately arranged over the previous year, working with my mother to transfer her vacation cabin into my name before selling it to an eager buyer from Boston. The sale had genuinely occurred, with the proceeds initially flowing to my offshore account rather than domestic holdings. This approach provided the perfect foundation for bringing funds back into visibility, a documented, legitimate source that connected to my premarital assets, operating completely outside Gregory's awareness or legal reach. The remaining offshore funds would continue growing under Mr. Harrington's management, providing the financial security I needed while I established my new professional identity. After sending final confirmation to Mr. Harrington, I closed the secure portal and powered down the encrypted laptop, returning it to its hidden compartment in my luggage. The physical security measures might have seemed excessive to some, but I'd learned from Gregory's own legal cases how often digital carelessness created vulnerability. I moved to the suite's balcony, allowing myself a moment to appreciate the significance of this step. The 7-year journey from that first overheard conversation to this moment had required patience, discipline, and a kind of emotional compartmentalization I hadn't known I possessed. Each incremental action, each transfer, each investment decision, each careful documentation had been a declaration of self-preservation. Not taken in anger or vengeance, but with the clear-eyed recognition that I needed to protect myself from a man who had come to see me as disposable. My phone chimed with a text from Rebecca. "Lunch still on for 1 hour? Can't wait to hear about yesterday." I smiled, texting back confirmation. Rebecca had been my touchstone throughout this process, the one person with whom I could speak openly about both the practical steps and the emotional journey. As I prepared to meet her, I felt a lightness that had nothing to do with financial security and everything to do with reclaimed agency. Gregory had walked away believing he had defined the terms of our ending. In 90 days, that illusion would begin to unravel. The loft in the Arts District exceeded my expectations. Converted from a century-old textile factory, it retained the industrial character, exposed brick walls, original wooden beams, and massive factory windows, while offering modern amenities that created a perfect balance of history and comfort. "It's just been listed," Elise explained as she unlocked the sliding metal door. "The owner is an architect who's relocating to Copenhagen for a 3-year project. He's looking for a tenant who will appreciate the space as much as he does." At 2,200 square feet, the loft was substantially smaller than the Westlake mansion, but its open layout and soaring ceilings created a sense of expansiveness that felt liberating rather than limiting. A mezzanine level housed the bedroom and a compact home office overlooking the main living area. The kitchen featured professional-grade appliances and an island crafted from reclaimed factory flooring. But it was the light that captivated me, northern exposure through the factory windows, creating the perfect illumination for the emerging art collection I planned to build. Gregory had always controlled our home's aesthetic, insisting on conservative pieces that projected traditional success. This space would showcase art that spoke to me, that reflected my evolving identity rather than someone else's expectations. "The rent is $4,200 monthly," Elise said tentatively, clearly concerned about the alignment with my newly divorced status. "There's some flexibility if you're interested in a longer-term lease." Gregory would have expected me to hesitate, to calculate whether my settlement would stretch to cover such an expense. Instead, I smiled. "I'll take it. 2-year lease with option to extend." Elise's surprise was momentary but visible. "Wonderful. I'll prepare the paperwork immediately." The decision was perfectly calibrated for my strategy, a rental that pushed the boundaries of what would seem financially prudent given my settlement, but not so extravagant as to raise questions about hidden resources. It established me in an area of the city Gregory rarely frequented, populated by artists, designers, and creative entrepreneurs, rather than the corporate and legal professionals of his social circle. Most importantly, it allowed me to begin constructing the visible framework of my new life, one that would eventually accommodate the full expression of my financial independence when the time came to reveal it. 3 days later, I signed the lease, using a certified check drawn on my newly established account at Atlantic Provincial Bank. The transaction was completely legitimate, properly documented, and, crucially, created the first public record of Catherine Ellison's financial existence separate from Gregory Moore. The second strategic action began with my visit to Oliver Carrick, a financial advisor recommended by Rebecca. Unlike the wealth management team Gregory had installed at his firm, Oliver specialized in working with entrepreneurs and independent professionals building their financial foundations. "Rebecca mentioned you're recently divorced and looking to establish a fresh financial identity," he said as we settled in his modestly appointed office. I appreciated his directness. "Yes. After 15 years of marriage, I'm essentially starting over, financially speaking." He nodded, his expression neutral but kind. "I see this situation often, unfortunately. What's your current financial picture?" I provided him with the details of my settlement, the figures Gregory believed constituted the entirety of my assets. Oliver took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the structure and timing of payments. "And your professional background?" he inquired. "Rebecca mentioned something about art consulting." "I have a master's in art history that I completed before my marriage," I explained. "I've maintained connections in the field, though not professionally. I'm exploring launching a consultancy focusing on corporate collections." Oliver considered this thoughtfully. "So we're looking at a multifaceted approach, managing your settlement to provide immediate security while creating space for your business to develop." He paused. "May I ask about your risk tolerance?" The conversation continued for over an hour, with Oliver outlining potential investment approaches for the assets Gregory knew about. I presented myself as cautiously optimistic, someone rebuilding, with limited resources but clear direction. What Oliver didn't know, what only Mr. Harrington, Vivian, and Rebecca were aware of, was that this visible financial plan was merely the surface layer of a much more comprehensive strategy. I'd recommend establishing a tiered approach, Oliver concluded, showing me a preliminary investment structure on his tablet. Secure base for living expenses, moderate growth portfolio for midterm stability, and a smaller allocation for higher risk opportunities that might accelerate your business development. I reviewed his proposal, noting how perfectly it aligned with what someone in my apparent position should do. "This looks ideal, Oliver. I'd like to proceed." As we completed the initial paperwork, I was struck by the parallel tracks my financial life now occupied. the visible path that aligned with expectations and the hidden foundation that would eventually transform those expectations entirely. Next morning, I met with Serena Diaz, a branding consultant who specialized in helping professionals reinvent their market presence. We'd been introduced through a connection from my graduate program who had no links to Gregory's world. Another deliberate choice to keep my evolving plans contained within separate spheres. So you're looking to establish an art consultancy, focused on corporate collections, Serena summarized after I'd outlined my concept. What's your vision for positioning? I want to bridge the traditional corporate art approach with emerging artists and contemporary perspectives, I explained. Many companies install generic, inoffensive pieces without considering how art can express organizational values and inspire creativity. Serena nodded enthusiastically. That's a compelling angle. Are you thinking of Catherine Moore Art Consulting or Catherine Ellison? I corrected smoothly. I'm returning to my maiden name professionally. She made a note without comment. Another advantage of working with people who didn't know me from my married life. Perfect. Let's talk about your initial market presence. We'll need to develop a strategic identity package, website, business materials, initial portfolio presentation. We spent 2 hours discussing everything from color palettes to typography, client acquisition strategies to presentation approaches. The consulting fees would consume a noticeable portion of my visible resources, exactly as someone launching a new venture might invest. This is the foundation for your new professional identity, Serena explained as she showed me preliminary design concepts. We're creating something authentic to your vision while establishing immediate credibility. I studied the designs, feeling a surge of genuine excitement that transcended strategic considerations. This wasn't just about creating a plausible use for my settlement funds or establishing a visible professional identity that explained my eventual financial stability. This was about reclaiming a passion I'd set aside when I'd made Gregory's career the priority. It's perfect, I told her, and meant it. As I left Serena's studio, I reflected on the interconnected elements of this second strategic phase. The loft, the financial restructuring, the business development. Each component established Catherine Ellison as a woman thoughtfully rebuilding her life within apparent constraints. To anyone observing, including Gregory, should he bother to check, I was making sensible if ambitious choices with limited resources. Nothing that would trigger suspicion or wounded pride. Nothing that suggested I possessed significantly more than the settlement he'd so carefully controlled. The visible narrative was taking shape exactly as planned, creating the perfect context for the revelation that would come precisely 90 days after our divorce was finalized. With my living situation secured and professional identity taking shape, I turned to the third component of my strategy, one that required particular finesse and patience. This phase involved carefully cultivated social visibility, creating the public narrative that would eventually make my financial transformation appear natural rather than suspicious. The opportunity presented itself through an unexpected source. My former thesis advisor, Dr. Eleanor Wilkins, now chair of the university's art history department. We'd maintained loose contact over the years, primarily through holiday cards and occasional emails, but I'd deliberately reached out to reconnect shortly before the divorce was finalized. "Catherine," she exclaimed when we met for coffee at a small cafe near campus. "How wonderful to see you after all this time." At 72, Eleanor remained formidable, sharp-eyed, elegantly composed, and deeply connected throughout the art world. She had been instrumental in my graduate studies, pushing me toward more ambitious research while opening doors to key institutions and collectors. "I've been following your work with the university's acquisition committee," I said as we settled, at a corner table. The Herrera collection was quite a coup. She smiled, pleased at the recognition. "It took 3 years of negotiation, but worth every minute. Now tell me about this art consultancy you're developing. It's about time you returned to the field." I outlined my concept, emphasizing the focus on emerging artists and thoughtful corporate collections. Eleanor listened intently, occasionally asking pointed questions about my approach and target clients. "You know," she said when I'd finished, "the timing is rather serendipitous. The department is hosting a symposium next month on contemporary art in corporate environments. One of our panelists just withdrew. Family emergency. Would you consider stepping in?" The invitation was perfect, a legitimate, prestigious platform to establish my professional visibility while connecting with potential clients. I'd be honored, though I should clarify I'm just launching my practice. Eleanor waved away my concern. Your academic foundation and perspective as someone entering this space with fresh eyes is exactly what the panel needs. The other participants are all established, consultants and corporate curators. You'll bring a valuable counterpoint. As we discussed the details, I recognized the opportunity for what it was, not just professional exposure, but the beginning of a public record that would eventually support the narrative of my success. When my offshore funds began entering the visible economy, this symposium would become part of the logical foundation explaining my financial evolution. There's a small honorarium, Eleanor added as an afterthought. Nothing substantial, academic budgets being what they are, but we cover all expenses and the networking opportunity is considerable. I accepted immediately, already envisioning how this would fit into my timeline. The symposium would occur approximately 6 weeks into my post-divorce life, enough time to establish my basic consulting framework, but well before the first major offshore transfer would become visible. Perfect timing, I said, meaning it in ways Eleanor couldn't possibly understand. The following week, I implemented the next element of this third strategic phase, selective social reemergence. During my marriage to Gregory, our social life had revolved almost exclusively around his professional connections, partners from his firm, clients, judges, and the inevitable charity circuit that accompanied his position. Now, I carefully reconstructed my social circles, reaching out to former classmates, reconnecting with friends I'd gradually lost touch with during my marriage, and building relationships with fellow residents in the arts district. Rebecca had been instrumental in this process, hosting a small dinner party that introduced me to several key figures in the city's creative community. Gallery owners, designers, and entrepreneurs who operated completely outside Gregory's sphere. "Everyone, this is Catherine Ellison," she'd said, deliberately using my maiden name as we'd discussed. "She's developing an art consultancy focused on bringing actual inspiration into corporate environments, rather than the soulless hotel art most companies inflict on their employees." The introduction had sparked immediate interest, leading to conversations that extended well beyond professional networking. For the first time in years, I found myself engaged in discussions about ideas, aesthetics, and creative possibilities, a stark contrast to the status-conscious conversations that had dominated Gregory's social gatherings. By the end of the evening, I'd collected several business cards, arranged coffee meetings with 2 gallery owners, and been invited to an upcoming exhibition featuring local artists, all organic connections that felt refreshingly authentic after years of calculated social positioning. "You're a natural at this," Rebecca observed as we cleaned up after the last guest departed. "I hardly recognized you tonight. You were practically glowing." It felt good, I admitted. Having conversations that weren't just about impressing someone or advancing Gregory's agenda. She studied me thoughtfully. "You know, I never said anything while you were married, but you gradually became smaller over the years, quieter, more contained. It was like watching someone slowly turn down their own volume." Her observation struck me with unexpected force. I didn't realize it was so visible. "Not to everyone," she assured me, "but I knew you before. I remember how you used to light up a room, how passionate you were about your ideas." She smiled. It's nice to see that woman again. The conversation had stayed with me, reinforcing my determination to approach this rebuilding process as more than just financial strategy. The carefully structured plan to reveal my hidden resources was necessary, but equally important was reclaiming the self that had been gradually diminished within my marriage. The third component of this strategic phase came through an introduction from one of Rebecca's dinner guests, Martin Chen, founder of a successful architectural visualization firm that worked with developers and corporate clients throughout the region. "Your concept is exactly what our clients need," he said when we met for lunch the following week. "They understand. Design matters for their physical spaces, but art remains an afterthought, something to fill wall space after the real decisions are made." Martin explained that his firm had recently expanded their services to include complete environment design, incorporating everything from lighting to acoustic elements. "But art selection is our weak point. We've been outsourcing it with mixed results." "What if we started with a pilot project?" I suggested. "I could develop a comprehensive art strategy for one of your upcoming clients, something that demonstrates how intentional curation enhances the overall environment you're creating." He considered this, nodding slowly. "We're beginning work with Meridian Solutions next month, a tech company establishing their new headquarters downtown. They're progressive, open to fresh approaches. Could be perfect." We spent the next hour outlining a potential collaboration. Martin would introduce me as a specialized consultant, I would develop an art direction proposal for the client, and if approved, we would share the implementation fee. "It won't be a massive project initially," he cautioned. "Maybe $30,000, $40,000 for acquisition, plus consultation fees. But if successful, it could lead to ongoing collaboration across multiple projects." For someone supposedly rebuilding from a limited settlement, this opportunity represented a significant potential income source, exactly the kind of professional breakthrough that would eventually help explain my improved financial situation, without revealing its true origins. As I left the restaurant, I texted Vivian a brief update. "Professional groundwork proceeding ahead of schedule. Exhibition panel confirmation, plus potential first major client." Her response came almost immediately. "Perfect timing. Foundation elements in place before any visible financial shifts. Keep documentation meticulous." That evening in my loft, I updated my strategic timeline, adjusting certain benchmarks to accommodate these new developments. The symposium would establish academic credibility. The potential Meridian project would create professional visibility. The expanding social circle would provide witnesses to my gradual establishment as Catherine Ellison, art consultant. All these elements would combine to create the perfect narrative framework for when the first significant transfer from my offshore account entered my visible financial ecosystem. Exactly 90 days after Gregory signed those divorce papers, believing he had secured everything of value. Exactly 87 days after our divorce was finalized, I encountered Gregory for the first time since the courthouse. The setting couldn't have been more perfect if I'd orchestrated it myself. The opening reception for a new exhibition at the Harrington Gallery, featuring contemporary artists exploring themes of transformation and identity. I was there legitimately, having developed a professional relationship with the gallery director through my expanding network. Gregory's presence was more surprising. He'd always considered such events tedious obligations rather than genuine interests. Later, I would learn he was accompanying a potential client with cultural aspirations, playing the role of sophisticated legal counsel. I spotted him before he saw me, giving me precious moments to prepare. He stood near the center of the gallery, whiskey in hand, nodding with practiced attention as the gallery director explained a large mixed-media piece. The young woman beside him, slim, blonde, expensively dressed, was clearly the client he was cultivating, her body language suggesting more than professional interest. I could have slipped away unnoticed. The gallery was crowded enough to enable a strategic retreat. Instead, I chose to remain, continuing my conversation with Martin Chen and the design director from Meridian Solutions, whose art acquisition project was now officially under my guidance. When Gregory finally noticed me, The momentary flash of surprise across his features was quickly masked by professional composure. He said something to his companions and made his way across the gallery, his expression settling into practiced neutrality. "Catherine," he greeted me, his tone carefully calibrated to project civil detachment. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Gregory," I replied simply. "I'm working with the Mercer Group on their collection." "And you?" He glanced toward his waiting companions. "Potential client, technology sector, expanding their legal representation." An awkward silence threatened, the kind that follows when former intimates become strangers. I filled it with professional courtesy. "Well, don't let me keep you from your client. Good seeing you." His eyes narrowed slightly, scanning my appearance with subtle assessment. I'd chosen my outfit carefully. A tailored black jumpsuit with architectural jewelry, projecting creative professionalism rather than the conservative elegance he'd always preferred. My hair, now cut into a modern bob instead of the longer style he'd favored, completed the visual statement of reinvention. "You look different," he observed, his tone suggesting he couldn't decide if this was a compliment or criticism. "I am different," I replied simply. Something flickered across his features, curiosity perhaps, or the first hint of uncertainty. The woman who stood before him didn't match the diminished, struggling ex-wife he had anticipated. I was composed, engaged in legitimate professional conversation, dressed with confident style. Nothing dramatic enough to provoke specific suspicion, just a gradually dawning realization that his carefully crafted narrative might not be unfolding as planned. "I should get back," he said finally. "Take care, Catherine." I nodded, already turning back to my companions, dismissing him with the same casual courtesy he had expected to deploy against me. As he walked away, I felt Martin watching with interest. "Ex-husband?" he guessed quietly. "Yes, first time seeing him since the divorce." Martin raised an eyebrow. "Well, you handled that with impressive grace. And did you notice how he kept looking back at you?" I hadn't, but I wasn't surprised. Gregory would be recalibrating, adjusting his understanding of my trajectory. The encounter was brief but significant, the first crack in his assumption that our separation had left me diminished. 3 days later, phase 2 of his discovery began. The university symposium on corporate art collections had been publicized, in both academic circles and the business community, with participants' profiles included in the promotional materials. My inclusion as a panelist, described as Catherine Ellison, art consultant specializing in emerging artists for corporate environments, appeared in the digital announcement distributed to the university's extensive donor and business network. Knew the moment Gregory saw it. Rebecca's husband Marcus called that evening to relay what he'd witnessed at their firm's partners meeting. Gregory was scrolling through emails during budget discussions, typical, when something made him stop. "Cold," Marcus reported. "He actually interrupted Harrison mid-sentence to ask if anyone knew you were speaking at some university event." "How did he seem?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Confused, mostly. Maybe a little irritated. Harrison asked why he cared, and Gregory muttered something about settlement disclosures and professional activities." Marcus paused. "Then James, you remember James Littleton? Mentioned he'd heard you were consulting on the Meridian Solutions headquarters project." I smiled at this perfect detail. The information was spreading organically through business networks, exactly as I'd anticipated. "And Gregory's reaction?" That's when it got interesting. He got this look, you know the one, where he's recalculating something and doesn't like the new equation. Started asking specific questions about the project scope when you'd secured it. James didn't know details, just that Meridian's CEO had mentioned working with an art consultant named Ellison. Marcus chuckled. Gregory corrected him. "Moore. Her name is Catherine Moore." And James just shrugged and said, "Not according to Meridian's CEO." The return to my maiden name, a detail Gregory had apparently overlooked in the divorce proceedings, represented another small but significant challenge to his narrative of my diminishment. Not just a symbolic reclamation, but a practical separation that made tracking my professional activities slightly more difficult. The third revelation came precisely 90 days after our divorce, triggered by a carefully orchestrated social media post from the Meridian Solutions design team. They shared images of their headquarters under development, tagging key consultants, including Catherine Ellison Fine Art, with a link to my newly launched professional website. The post was entirely legitimate, part of Meridian's regular updates on their new facility. What Gregory couldn't know was that I'd timed the website launch to coincide exactly with this moment, creating a visible professional presence just as the first substantial transfer from my offshore account was being processed. That same day, I completed the purchase of my loft, converting from renter to owner through a transaction structured exactly as my financial strategy had outlined. The down payment, $180,000, came from the first transfer of my offshore funds, now documented as proceeds from my mother's property sale in Vermont. To anyone investigating my financial situation, the timing would appear fortunate but plausible. A new consultant securing her first major client, receiving family property proceeds, and establishing both professional and personal foundations simultaneously. The real estate transaction would become public record within days. The professional website would appear in any basic search of my name. The corporate client connection was now visible across business networks. Every element had been perfectly positioned before the financial shift that would eventually reveal the truth. I was not the destitute ex-wife Gregory had intended to create. That evening, I received a text from an unknown number. Interesting career development. Didn't realize art consulting was so immediately lucrative. We should talk. Gregory's message conveyed volumes in its carefully neutral phrasing, suspicion wrapped in feigned curiosity, the first direct acknowledgement that his understanding of my post-divorce trajectory required adjustment. I didn't respond. The pieces were in motion, the discovery phase beginning exactly as planned. Gregory was noticing the inconsistencies, sensing that something didn't align with his expectations, but still unable to identify the full scope of what he had missed. His realization would unfold gradually over the coming weeks, each new discovery building on the last until the inescapable truth emerged. In divorcing me, he had lost far more than he'd ever understood. The first direct confrontation came exactly as I had anticipated, not through another text message or chance encounter, but via Harrison Wells, Gregory's attorney and longtime friend. His call came on a Tuesday morning as I was reviewing portfolio options for the Meridian project. "Catherine, Harrison Wells here. I hope you're doing well." His tone was professionally cordial, but carried an undercurrent of calculation. "I wonder if we might meet to discuss a few lingering matters regarding your settlement." "I wasn't aware of any lingering matters, Harrison," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. The agreement seemed quite comprehensive. Just a few clarifications that would be better discussed in person. Perhaps coffee tomorrow? I agreed to meet him at a cafe downtown, neutral territory, already understanding the real purpose behind this sudden outreach. Gregory had noticed enough discrepancies in my post-divorce situation to warrant investigation, but wasn't yet ready to engage directly. Harrison arrived precisely on time, immaculately dressed in the uniform of successful corporate attorneys everywhere, charcoal suit, subtle tie, expression of practiced concern. After perfunctory pleasantries, he placed a thin folder on the table between us. "Gregory has expressed some concerns about potential oversights in the asset disclosure process," he began carefully. "Some recent developments suggest there might have been resources not fully accounted for during our negotiations." I took a slow sip of my coffee, maintaining eye contact. "That's an interesting perspective, considering how thoroughly your team investigated our finances. What specific concerns does Gregory have?" Harrison shifted slightly, professional composure momentarily disrupted by my calm response. "There's the matter of your real estate purchase, for one. The down payment exceeds what would be reasonably possible given the settlement terms. The property transaction involved funds from my family, proceeds from selling my mother's Vermont cabin. Those assets predated my marriage to Gregory and were never part of our marital estate." Every word was technically true, carefully constructed, to reveal nothing about the offshore mechanisms involved. "And your new consultancy? It appears to have launched with considerable resources. Website, marketing materials, business infrastructure, all within months of the divorce." I smiled slightly. "Good business planning doesn't require enormous capital, Harrison. I've been strategic with my limited resources and fortunate in developing the right professional relationships." I paused, then added, "Gregory always underestimated my capabilities. I see that hasn't changed." Harrison studied me with new attention, clearly recognizing that this conversation wasn't proceeding as Gregory had anticipated. "Catherine, I'll be direct. Gregory believes there may have been undisclosed accounts or assets that should have been considered in the settlement. If that's the case, we have legal remedies available." "I'm sure you do," I acknowledged. "And I'm equally sure that Gregory's legal team, including yourself, conducted exhaustive financial investigations before finalizing our agreement. Every account, every asset within your considerable reach was thoroughly examined and incorporated into the settlement. Gregory received exactly what he wanted, everything he could see." My emphasis on those final words was subtle, but unmistakable. Harrison caught it immediately, his expression shifting from professional authority to cautious reassessment. "If you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Harrison," I interrupted gently. "I'm simply stating facts. The divorce is final. The settlement was comprehensive regarding all discoverable assets. Gregory received what he believed was everything of value." He studied me for a long moment, recalibrating his understanding of the situation and of me. "I'll convey your position to Gregory." "Please do," I said, gathering my things to leave. "And Harrison? You might remind him that further investigation would only draw attention to certain aspects of his own financial arrangements that remained conveniently obscured during our proceedings. I chose not to pursue those avenues out of a desire for clean closure. That preference could change. It was a calculated risk, hinting at knowledge of Gregory's own financial maneuvering without specifying details. In truth, I had discovered certain questionable transactions during my years of quiet observation, but had deliberately left them unexplored during the divorce. The implications, however, would give Gregory reason to reconsider any aggressive legal strategy. Harrison's slight nod confirmed my message was received. "I understand. Good day, Catherine." Gregory's second countermeasure emerged a week later, through professional channels. Martin Chen called, his tone apologetic but concerned. "Catherine, something strange happened. Gregory Moore contacted our CEO directly, suggesting we should be cautious about our collaboration with you." "What specifically did he say?" I asked, already anticipating the approach. "Nothing directly damaging. He's too careful for that. Just insinuations about your experience level and financial stability. He framed it as professional courtesy, since his firm has connections to one of our investors." "And how did your CEO respond?" Martin chuckled. "David has limited patience for legal meddling in creative decisions. He asked for specifics, and when Gregory couldn't provide any, he thanked him for his concern and ended the call." He paused. "But Catherine, I thought you should know. This felt personal." "It is personal," I confirmed, "but it's not something that will affect our work together. Gregory is discovering that his understanding of the situation, and of me, was flawed. He's adjusting rather poorly to that realization. This attempt to undermine my professional opportunities revealed Gregory's growing desperation. Having failed to intimidate me through legal channels, he was now targeting my business relationships. A strategy that might have worked if I had been as vulnerable as he believed." His third and most direct countermeasure came in the form of an unexpected visit to my loft. The building's security desk called to announce Gregory Moore requesting access. After brief consideration, I authorized it. The confrontation was inevitable, and I preferred it occur on my territory, where every element from furnishings to artwork reinforced the narrative of my independence. When the elevator opened directly into my loft space, Gregory stepped out with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to controlling situations. That confidence faltered momentarily as he took in the space, the soaring ceilings, the artfully arranged furniture, the large-scale paintings from emerging artists that would have been beyond the means of the financially diminished ex-wife. He had expected to find impressive accommodations, he observed, attempting to regain his footing. Quite a step up from what your settlement would seem to support. Hello to you too, Gregory, I replied calmly. What brings you here unannounced? He moved further into the space, his assessment continuing. Curiosity primarily. Harrison conveyed your perspective on the settlement situation. I thought a direct conversation might be more productive. A conversation about what, exactly? About how someone with virtually no income and limited settlement funds manages to purchase property, establish a business, and create this. He gestured around the loft. Within months of divorce. About financial disclosures and legal obligations. About consequences. I moved to the kitchen area, putting the island between us. Not out of fear, but strategy, controlling the physical dynamic of our interaction. Would you like coffee, Gregory? This might be a longer conversation than you anticipated. His eyes narrowed at my composure. The woman before him, confident, established, utterly unintimidated, contradicted everything he had expected to find. What I'd like is an explanation. No, I corrected gently. What you'd like is control. You've realized something doesn't align with your narrative, and that uncertainty is intolerable because it suggests you might have missed something important. That maybe, just maybe, you didn't account for everything when you so carefully dismantled our marriage. Color rose in his face, not just anger but the first flush of genuine alarm. If you concealed assets during our proceedings, I concealed nothing that your extremely thorough legal team could discover, I interrupted. Every account, every investment, every property that existed within the parameters of your investigation was properly disclosed and divided according to your terms. You got exactly what you wanted, Gregory. Everything you could see. There it was again, that particular emphasis that had unsettled Harrison. Gregory caught it immediately, his legal mind racing to identify the implication. What does that mean? He demanded, his composure slipping further. I smiled slightly, pouring myself coffee with steady hands. It means you should consider very carefully whether continuing this line of inquiry serves your interests. Some questions once asked cannot be unasked. Some answers once given change everything. For the first time since I'd known him, Gregory Moore appeared genuinely uncertain, the ground shifting beneath his carefully constructed reality. You're bluffing. Am I? I set my cup down gently. You've spent the past 3 weeks investigating me, Gregory. You've questioned my finances, contacted my business associates, sent your attorney to threaten legal action. All because you can't reconcile the woman standing before you with the broken, destitute ex-wife you expected to create. Ask yourself why that might be. He stared at me, recalculating everything he thought he knew. I could almost see the mental review of our marriage, searching for missed clues, overlooked details, anything that might explain this bewildering disparity between expectation and reality. I want answers, he said finally, his voice less commanding than before. No, Gregory, I replied softly. What you want is impossible. You want to return to the comfortable certainty that you controlled everything, that nothing existed beyond your awareness. That certainty is gone, and no explanation I might offer will restore it. I moved toward the elevator, a clear indication that our conversation was ending. I suggest you accept that the divorce is final, the settlement complete, and your understanding of who I am was profoundly limited. Further pursuit of this matter will only reveal the extent of what you failed to see, and I'm not certain your pride could withstand that revelation. Gregory didn't move, his expression hardening into something between anger and genuine fear. This isn't over. Actually, I said as the elevator doors opened, it was over the moment you decided I was disposable. You just didn't know it yet. Final confrontation occurred exactly 120 days after our divorce was finalized. I hadn't planned it that way. The specific timing was Gregory's choice, but there was a certain symmetry to it. 4 months to the day after he believed he had claimed everything of value, he would discover just how profoundly he had miscalculated. The Atlantic Provincial Bank downtown branch provided the perfect setting, neutral territory with the necessary privacy for what would unfold. I had received Gregory's terse message that morning. Need to meet. Financial matters require resolution. APB downtown, 2 p.m., private banking suite arranged. His choice of location wasn't surprising. Atlantic Provincial handled many of his firm's corporate accounts, and the private banking suite offered both discretion and the implied authority he believed would strengthen his position. What Gregory didn't know was that I had anticipated this move, had prepared for precisely this scenario, right down to the location. I arrived 5 minutes early, dressed in a tailored navy suit that projected quiet authority, a deliberate contrast to the softer, more decorative styling Gregory had always preferred during our marriage. The bank manager greeted me personally, escorting me to the private suite where Gregory waited. He stood when I entered, his posture rigid with barely contained tension. Beside him sat Harrison Wells and another man I recognized as Michael Devereaux, a forensic accountant Gregory's firm often engaged for complex financial investigations. Catherine. Gregory nodded stiffly. Thank you for coming. Of course, I replied, taking the seat across from them, though I'm curious about this urgent financial matter requiring resolution. Gregory exchanged glances with his colleagues before leaning forward slightly. We've completed a comprehensive post-settlement investigation of your financial position. The discrepancies between your resources and your current circumstances have led us to some interesting discoveries. I remained silent, my expression neutral. This was the moment Gregory had been building toward, the triumphant revelation, the reassertion of control, the proof that he had, once again, mastered the situation. Through considerable effort, he continued, we've identified a previously undisclosed property transaction involving your mother's estate. The timing and structure of this transaction suggests deliberate concealment during our proceedings. I nodded slightly. The Vermont cabin sale. Yes, I mentioned this to Harrison during our coffee meeting several weeks ago. Hardly undisclosed. Or concealed. Gregory's jaw tightened. What you failed to mention was the actual sale price, considerably higher than regional comparables would suggest, or the routing of those funds through 3 separate financial institutions before they appeared in your accounts. I wasn't aware I needed to provide a detailed financial flowchart for assets that preceded our marriage and were explicitly excluded from our marital estate, I replied calmly. The transaction was legitimate, fully documented, and properly reported to relevant tax authorities. Michael Devereaux cleared his throat slightly. Mrs. Moore? Ms. Ellison, I corrected gently. Ms. Ellison, he amended. The transaction pattern displays hallmarks of what we would typically identify as layering, a process used to obscure the origins of funds. This raises significant concerns about potential hidden assets that should have been disclosed during the divorce proceedings. I smiled slightly. That's a serious allegation, Mr. Devereaux. I assume you have definitive evidence rather than speculative interpretation? The subtle shift in his expression confirmed what I already knew. They had theories, but no concrete proof. Suspicions, but no actionable evidence. My careful structuring of the transfers had created just enough legitimate documentation to withstand superficial scrutiny while revealing nothing about the offshore account that was their true source. "We have sufficient grounds for a court to order a complete forensic audit," Harrison interjected. "If undisclosed assets are discovered, the settlement would be invalidated, and the court would likely impose punitive measures." Gregory leaned back, confidence returning as his legal team outlined the threat. This was familiar territory for him, leveraging the legal system to apply pressure, creating fear to force compliance. The moment had arrived. I opened my handbag and removed a sealed envelope, placing it carefully on the table between us. "Before you proceed with that strategy, you might want to review this," I said quietly. Gregory eyed the envelope suspiciously. "What is it?" "Documentation. You requested, though perhaps not in the way you intended, a complete accounting of my current financial position, including all sources, transactions, and holdings." Harrison reached for the envelope, but Gregory intercepted it, tearing it open with barely concealed impatience. He scanned the first page, his expression shifting from smug anticipation to confusion, then to a slowly dawning disbelief as he turned to the second page, then the third. "This can't be right," he muttered, color draining from his face. "Every figure is accurate, every account verified, every transaction legitimate," I confirmed, "including the offshore account established 7 years ago that currently holds assets in excess of $2 million. Harrison and Michael exchanged alarmed glances as Gregory continued reading, his composure crumbling with each page. 7 years? He finally managed, looking up with genuine shock. "You've had this account for 7 years?" "Yes," I said simply. "Established with my inheritance funds, maintained separately throughout our marriage, and legally excluded from our marital estate since it predated our relationship and was never commingled with joint assets." The perfect, devastating truth landed between us. I had done nothing illegal, nothing that violated the terms of our settlement. I had simply possessed resources Gregory had never known existed, had never thought to investigate, had never imagined I was capable of establishing and maintaining. The aftermath of our confrontation at Atlantic Provincial Bank unfolded exactly as I had anticipated, not in dramatic public scenes, but in the quiet, devastating collapse of Gregory's carefully constructed narrative. Harrison was the first to recognize the legal reality. If the account truly predates the marriage and remained separate throughout, it would be considered separate property under state law, he acknowledged quietly, his eyes moving from the documents to Gregory's increasingly pale face. "Especially with no commingling of marital assets. The paper trail is impeccable," I confirmed. "Every deposit appropriately sourced, every investment decision properly documented. Mr. Harrington at Parton Wainwright has maintained meticulous records since the account's establishment." At the mention of Parton Wainwright, a name familiar to anyone in high-level financial circles for their discretion and exclusivity, Michael Devereaux's expression shifted from professional skepticism to reluctant recognition. He knew, as did the others, that their investigation had failed to uncover what had been deliberately placed beyond their reach. "Gregory," Harrison said carefully, "I believe we should discuss this privately before proceeding further." But Gregory wasn't listening. He was staring at me with a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension, seeing me, truly seeing me, perhaps for the first time in years. Not as the decorative accessory to his success, not as the dependent wife he had discarded, but as someone who had quietly outmaneuvered him at his own game. "You knew," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You knew I was planning to leave, planning to take everything." I recognized the signs, I corrected gently. The emotional withdrawal, the financial restructuring, the gradual isolation. I didn't know the specific timing or circumstances you would choose, but I understood the direction we were heading. For 7 years? The timeline seemed to wound him more than the financial revelation. You've been preparing for this for 7 years? I considered him thoughtfully. Not initially. At first, it was simply financial prudence, creating security independent of our marriage. But as time passed and your behavior changed, yes, I began preparing for the possibility of this outcome. The realization visibly moved through him. 7 years of believing himself cleverly Machiavellian while I quietly observed, analyzed, and prepared. 7 years of dismissing my capabilities while I methodically built a financial foundation beyond his awareness or reach. 7 years of underestimation that had culminated in this moment of irrevocable revelation. I think we're finished here, I said, rising from my seat. The documentation provides everything you need to understand that your legal options are, in fact, non-existent. The divorce is final, the settlement complete, and any attempt to reopen proceedings would only result in public examination of your own financial maneuvers during our marriage. Scrutiny I suspect you would prefer to avoid. Harrison placed a restraining hand on Gregory's arm as he started to rise, a silent but clear message. Don't make this worse. I gathered my belongings calmly, maintaining the composed demeanor that had defined my approach throughout this process. I would suggest we maintain appropriate distance from this point forward. Our connection has been legally severed, and I see no benefit in further interaction. As I moved toward the door, Gregory found his voice one last time. Why? He asked, the single word containing layers of bewilderment. Why not reveal this during the divorce? Why let me believe I'd taken everything? I paused, considering him with genuine reflection rather than triumph or anger. Because you needed to believe you had won. Your sense of victory was essential to the clean break we both required. I smiled slightly. And because sometimes, Gregory, the most powerful position is the one your opponent doesn't know you hold. With that, I walked out of the private banking suite, leaving Gregory to confront not just the financial reality he had failed to discover, but the more profound truth that had eluded him throughout our marriage. He had never truly known the woman he had married, never understood her capabilities, and consequently, never recognized what he was losing until it was irretrievably gone. The evening after the confrontation at Atlantic Provincial, I stood on my loft's balcony watching the sunset transform the city skyline from gleaming glass to amber-tinged silhouettes. A glass of Barolo, a varietal Gregory had always dismissed as overrated, rested in my hand, its complex notes perfectly complementing this moment of reflection. I had anticipated feeling something more dramatic after the final revelation. Perhaps vindication or triumph, maybe even lingering anger finally finding release. Instead, I experienced a profound, almost meditative calm. The confrontation hadn't been an emotional climax, but simply the natural conclusion to a chapter that had effectively ended years ago. The realization was both surprising and illuminating. My emotional detachment from Gregory had preceded our legal separation by a considerable margin. While I had been methodically building my financial independence, I had simultaneously been dismantling my emotional dependence, a process so gradual I hadn't fully recognized its completion until this moment. My phone chimed with a text from Rebecca. Just heard from Marcus. Apparently Gregory canceled the partners' dinner with some vague excuse about a personal matter. How did it go? I smiled slightly, typing back, exactly as anticipated. I'll tell you tomorrow at lunch. As I set the phone down, I recognized another subtle shift. I felt no desire to immediately share the details of Gregory's reaction, no need to replay the scene for validation or satisfaction. The moment was complete in itself, requiring no external affirmation. The doorbell interrupted my thoughts. The security desk hadn't announced a visitor, which meant it could only be someone I had pre-approved for direct access. I moved to the elevator entrance, checking the security camera to confirm it was Vivian. I brought celebration provisions, she announced as she entered, holding up a bottle of champagne. Given your text, I assumed everything went according to plan. It did, I confirmed, taking the bottle, vintage Dom Perignon. Vivian's signature for significant victories. Though it feels less like a celebration and more like closure. She studied me with professional insight as I gathered glasses. That's actually healthier. Celebration implies emotional investment. Closure suggests completion and forward movement. We settled in the living area, the city lights now emerging against the darkening sky beyond the windows. As I poured the champagne, Vivian raised an eyebrow. So? Details, please. Professional curiosity demands satisfaction. I described the meeting at Atlantic Provincial, Gregory's initial confidence, the forensic accountant's theories, Harrison's legal threats, and finally, the devastating revelation of my long-established offshore account. The documentation was what truly finished it, I explained. Not just account statements, but the complete history. Original establishment with inherited funds, consistent separation from marital assets, proper tax compliance. Gregory realized immediately there was no legal avenue to pursue. And his reaction? Vivian asked. Professional interest evident. Shock initially. Then a peculiar kind of deflation. As if something fundamental in his understanding of reality had collapsed. I paused, considering the memory. The most revealing moment came at the end, when he asked why I hadn't disclosed the account during the proceedings. A fascinating question, Vivian noted. He wasn't asking about the legal implications, but the psychological motivation? That suggests his primary concern wasn't the money itself, but the realization that you had outmaneuvered him, that his narrative of your relationship was fundamentally flawed. Her observation crystallized something I had sensed but not fully articulated. Yes, exactly. The financial discovery was secondary to the personal revelation, that I had been capable of something he never imagined, that his assessment of me had been catastrophically incomplete. We sipped our champagne in companionable silence, both processing the implications. Finally, Vivian spoke again, her tone shifting from professional to personal. How do you feel, Catherine? Truly? I considered the question carefully, looking inward with genuine curiosity rather than predetermined expectation. Unburdened, I said finally. Not just from the marriage or the pretense of the past months, but from something more fundamental, the need for Gregory's recognition or understanding. That, Vivian said softly, is the real victory. She was right, I realized. The offshore account had secured my financial independence, but this emotional detachment, this complete liberation from seeking Gregory's validation or fearing his judgment, represented the more profound achievement. What's next for you? Vivian asked, refilling our glasses. With the confrontation behind you and your financial position secure, what does Catherine Ellison want now? The question opened before me like an unexplored landscape. Possibilities, extending in all directions without the limitations I had grown accustomed to navigating. My art consultancy was developing momentum, with the Meridian project already generating referrals to other corporate clients. My social and professional networks were expanding beyond anything I had experienced during my marriage. My financial foundation provided security without defining my choices. I think, I said slowly, that's precisely what I'm going to discover. Not what Gregory expected me to be, not what our marriage required me to become, but who I actually am when those constraints no longer apply. Vivian raised her glass in a toast. To Catherine Ellison, discovered rather than defined. Later, after Vivian had departed, I returned to the balcony with the remainder of my Barolo. The city below pulsed with evening energy. Couples dining in rooftop restaurants, theaters releasing audiences into the night, taxis navigating the grid of illuminated streets. I felt a curious connection to this urban landscape that I had never experienced in the isolated luxury of our suburban mansion. There was authenticity in the city's unapologetic existence, its constant evolution, its embrace of both beauty and grit, its refusal to be diminished or contained. Gregory would be somewhere in that glittering expanse tonight, perhaps in his penthouse apartment, perhaps at his club, perhaps seeking comfort from whatever young associate currently occupied the role of admiring audience. Wherever he was, he would be confronting a reality fundamentally different from the one he had confidently navigated yesterday. A world where Catherine Ellison existed not as the diminished ex-wife he had dismissed, but as someone who had silently claimed her power long before he realized it was gone. I finished my wine and turned away from the view, leaving Gregory's fate and feelings firmly in the past where they belonged. The confrontation was complete, the emotional ties severed, the future entirely my own to shape. 6 months after the day confrontation at Atlantic Provincial Bank, my life had settled into rhythms entirely of my own making. The art consultancy had expanded beyond my initial projections, with the Meridian Solutions project serving as a portfolio cornerstone that attracted similar corporate clients seeking thoughtful, intentional collections rather than generic decorative pieces. I had hired 2 associates, both recent art history graduates with complementary specialties, and established a small but elegant office space in the Arts District. The business model had evolved to include not just acquisition services, but ongoing curation, rotation programs, and educational components that connected employees with the artists whose work surrounded them. Most satisfying was the partnership I'd developed with local artists, creating exhibition opportunities and commissions that supported emerging talents, while providing clients with unique, meaningful works. This component of the business generated minimal profit but maximum fulfillment, a balance I could afford given my secure financial foundation. My personal life had undergone equally significant transformation. The carefully curated social circle of Gregory's professional world had been replaced by genuine friendships based on shared interests and authentic connection. My loft had become a gathering place for artists, designers, writers, and thinkers, people whose conversation extended beyond status signaling and career positioning to explore ideas, challenges, and possibilities. I had even begun dating again, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. James, a professor of architectural history I'd met through university connections, approached relationships with the same thoughtful consideration he brought to his academic work. Our connection developed gradually, conversations extending over dinners, weekend gallery visits, shared appreciation for both aesthetics and ideas. Unlike Gregory, James had no interest in molding or diminishing me to enhance his own stature. He engaged with my work and thoughts not as accessories to his life, but as independently valuable contributions. The contrast was both stark and illuminating. "You seem different tonight," Rebecca observed during one of our regular dinners. "More present somehow." I considered her observation. "I think I've finally stopped looking over my shoulder." For months after the confrontation with Gregory, I was still anticipating some countermove: legal complications, professional interference, social maneuvering. I realized recently that I've stopped expecting those reactions. "Because you know he can't do anything?" "More because I've recognized it wouldn't matter if he did," I clarified. "My life is established on foundations he can't touch, not just financially, but professionally, socially, personally. I'm no longer organizing any part of my existence around anticipating or countering Gregory's actions." Rebecca smiled. "That's what I'm seeing, then. You're fully inhabiting your own life instead of navigating the negative space left by his absence." Her insight resonated deeply. For months after the divorce, even with my financial security and professional momentum, some part of me had remained oriented around the Gregory-shaped void, defining my choices in contrast to our former life, measuring my success against the diminishment he had intended. That orientation had finally, completely shifted. My decisions now emerged from internal compass points. What interested me, what challenged me, what contributed meaningfully to the world I wanted to create. Gregory had become irrelevant not through deliberate exclusion, but through natural, Obsolescence as my authentic life expanded beyond the boundaries our marriage had established. The offshore account that had secured my financial independence now represented just one element of a multifaceted life built on capabilities. Gregory had never recognized and potential he had systematically underestimated. The funds remained largely untouched, growing steadily under Mr. Harrington's continued management. Financial security that supported my choices without defining them. I had become, perhaps for the first time since early adulthood, fully myself, neither reacting against external expectations nor conforming to imposed limitations. Catherine Ellison existed now as her own creation, defined by her own terms, moving through the world with a clarity and purpose entirely self-determined. 1 year to the day after Gregory had slid those divorce papers across our kitchen table, I stood in a gallery downtown, surrounded by the opening night crowd of my first curated exhibition. Reimagining Value featured works from 12 emerging artists exploring themes of worth, perception, and transformation, concepts that resonated deeply with my own journey. The event represented a milestone for my consultancy, a deliberate expansion from corporate services to public curation. The gallery space, converted from an abandoned bank building, complete with the original vault now housing light installations, provided the perfect setting for art that challenged conventional definitions of value. As I moved through the crowd, engaging with artists and attendees, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in one of the gallery's massive windows. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the carefully maintained corporate wife who had once organized her appearance, conversations, and aspirations around her husband's preferences. This version of Catherine Ellison moved with natural confidence, dressed for her own aesthetic pleasure, and spoke with the easy authority of someone comfortable in her expertise and place in the world. The journey from that kitchen table to this gallery opening hadn't followed a straight line. There had been moments of doubt, unexpected challenges, and occasional setbacks alongside the carefully planned strategic moves. The offshore account had provided financial security, but rebuilding my identity had required resources no bank could hold. Courage, resilience, creativity, and the willingness to reimagine possibilities beyond the limitations I had internalized. "Catherine, this is extraordinary," Eleanor approached, champagne in hand. My former advisor had become a mentor and friend during this year of transformation. The concept, the curation, the conversation it's generating. You've created something truly significant here. "Thank you," I said, genuinely moved by her assessment. It feels like all the pieces finally connecting. My academic background, business experience, personal journey, like I've been preparing for this moment without fully realizing it. "That's how the most authentic work emerges," she observed. "Not forced into existence, but discovered when we're finally ready to recognize it." As we continued our conversation, I noticed a familiar figure entering the gallery. Gregory, accompanied by a woman I didn't recognize. Our paths had crossed occasionally in professional contexts throughout the year, each encounter marked by strained civility and careful distance. His appearance tonight was unexpected, particularly given the deliberate separation between our social and professional circles. Eleanor followed my gaze. "Your ex-husband appears to be attending your triumph. How very complex of him." I watched. As Gregory oriented himself to the space, his legal precision evident even in how he surveyed the room. "Actually, it's perfectly consistent. Gregory has always needed to witness firsthand anything that challenges his understanding of reality. And this certainly qualifies," Eleanor noted dryly. "Shall I run interference?" "No need," I assured her. "That chapter is fully closed." And it was. When Gregory eventually made his way toward me, I greeted him with the professional courtesy I would extend to any gallery visitor. No lingering resentment, no need to prove anything, no desire to highlight the contrast between his expectations and my reality. "Congratulations on the exhibition," he said, his tone carefully neutral. very impressive accomplishment. Thank you for coming, I replied simply. I hope you enjoy the artwork. The interaction lasted less than a minute, brief, unremarkable, and utterly devoid of the emotional charge that had once defined our exchanges. Gregory was simply another attendee, neither significant enough to avoid nor important enough to impress. Later that evening, after the successful opening had concluded and I had returned to my loft, I found myself reflecting not on Gregory's appearance but on the journey that had rendered his presence so inconsequential. The offshore account, that deliberate financial foundation I had established 7 years before our marriage ended, had served its essential purpose. It had provided not just material security, but the psychological freedom to rebuild without compromise or desperation. Yet the greatest value of those offshore millions hadn't been in the money itself, but in what it represented: my capacity for strategic thinking, patient execution, and quiet determination. Those same qualities had ultimately shaped every aspect of my post-divorce transformation. The careful reconstruction of my professional identity, the thoughtful cultivation of authentic relationships, the deliberate creation of environments that nurtured rather than diminished me, all emerged from the same core strengths that had enabled me to secure my financial independence long before Gregory recognized its significance. I moved to my balcony, watching the city lights against the night sky. Somewhere in that urban landscape, Gregory was likely processing his observations from the gallery, perhaps beginning to genuinely understand what he had failed to see during our 15 years together. Perhaps not. His recognition, or lack thereof, no longer mattered to my story. What mattered was the quiet truth I had discovered through this journey. True wealth existed not in offshore accounts or visible success, but in the capacity to recognize your own value when others fail to see it, and the courage to protect and nurture that value against all attempts to diminish it. Gregory had taken everything he could see in our divorce, but he had overlooked the most valuable asset of all: the woman who had been invisible to him throughout their marriage, the woman who had quietly prepared for independence while he presumed dependence, the woman who had emerged from his dismissal, not broken but fully realized. That woman, standing now in the life she had carefully, deliberately created, was the true fortune he had never recognized. And unlike the houses, cars, and investment accounts he had claimed in our settlement, this was one asset that had never been his to take. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.